This is a short history on a series of stereoscopic views titled In the Bluffs on the Winona and St. Peter Railroad. I enjoy researching early Minnesota railroads. When I came across this old stereoscopic view, I immediately purchased it. Clearly, it checked all the right boxes for me. When I received my new view, I was surprised how clear and sharp the image was. For that reason, I ordered a 10 by 10 enlargement of it. Several years later, I came across someone else selling a series of views, all entitled In the Bluffs on the Winona and St. Peter Railroad. My earlier purchase was the first view in this set. To my amazement, there was a total of 23 different views. My curiosity was piqued, so I purchased the set. And here they are. As a historical researcher, I wanted to know more than what these views showed. So let's start with the words on the left side of each view. It says, photographed under the auspices of the Winona and St. Peter Railroad Company. Obviously, this railroad was initially built from Winona to St. Peter, Minnesota. Later, it even expanded further west. The first mile of the railroad was completed on November 5th, 1862. A locomotive then chugged down the track, becoming the first locomotive ever to run on a railroad west of the Mississippi River in Minnesota. This was during the Civil War, so it was hard to find workers and equipment. It took until November 24th, 1863, for the railroad to push through the bluffs west of Stockton, Minnesota. For those of you who have never seen the bluffs along the Mississippi River west of Winona, they are pretty spectacular. Here is a drawing of Winona from 1874, which shows the city on the west side of the Mississippi River and the bluffs just to the west. These bluffs were not continuous, there were valleys within them. The Winona and St. Peter Railroad initially paralleled the Mississippi River to Minnesota City. From that point, the railroad turned southwest, then south to Stockton. From Stockton, the railroad continued southwest through a series of turns to Lewiston. The turn to the southwest from Minnesota City was through the Rolling Stone Valley. The Rolling Stone Valley actually had several branches: north, west, middle, and south. The railroad followed the southern branch. Each branch of the valley contained a river or stream. The south branch followed Garvin Brook. The 1874 Andreas Atlas of Minnesota showed several drawings, like this one, of what the valleys around Winona looked like back then. The valley bottoms were somewhat thin and flat, while the edges rose substantially on either side. The 1874 artist even captured the Winona and St. Peter Railroad southwest of Minnesota City at the Monk property, where the railroad crossed Garvin Brook. Here is that drawing. Other than the bridge that was needed to cross the brook, you can see how relatively flat the railroad grade was at that point. As the railroad progressed up the south branch of Rolling Stone Valley, the railroad grade slowly increased. However, as it made an S-turn west of Stockton, the railroad engineers were challenged with how to get the railroad up and over the final rise in the Bluffs. This is where the In the Bluffs views were taken. So why was this S-turn so spectacular? The local Winona newspaper provided the answer. In this area, there was a series of 5 wide gaps, which were spanned by trestle bridges. The first bridge was 700 feet long and 42 feet high. An 1894 plat map shows how the railroad followed Garvin Brook in this S-turn. In this section, there were 5 places where the railroad crisscrossed the brook. In addition to having 5 bridges, the railroad grade also had to make a series of cuts through the bluffs, some 200 or 300 feet long and 80 feet deep. This topographical map shows that the lowest elevation of the Garvin Brook Valley, shown in yellow, was about 1,100 feet. The elevation on the top of the bluffs, shown in brown, was 1,200 feet. So this was a rise of about 100 feet. Railroad grade is calculated using the slope formula. Slope is equal to the rise divided by the run, multiplied by 100. Using the 100-foot rise in elevation, over about 5 miles, gives about a 4% slope, or 4% railroad grade. Generally, railroads did not want to exceed 4% for most operations. Point 1 shows the first bluff that was cut into, which is where the S-turn began. Point 2 contained bluffs on either side of the railroad, where multiple cuts were made. Finally, on the right side of the original view, it said published by J. E. Whitney, 174 3rd Street, St. Paul, Minnesota. The 1867 St. Paul City Directory showed Combs and Whitney photographers, books, and stationery located at 174 3rd Street. Here is another early newspaper advertisement for the company, written in German. The October 7th, 1868 issue of the Winona Daily Republican actually mentioned the Winona visit by Charles Zimmerman from the Combs and Whitney Gallery of St. Paul. Going back to the 1867 St. Paul City Directory, Charles Zimmerman was listed as a photographer for the Whitney Gallery. So who was Zimmerman? The book titled The History of Ramsey County and the City of St. Paul contained a short biography on Zimmerman. Charles Zimmerman was born in France in 1844. He arrived in America in 1848 and came to St. Paul in 1856. At the age of 14, he constructed a rudimentary camera by himself. Since he wanted to be a photographer, he worked at the Whitney Gallery to gain experience. When Zimmerman arrived in Winona in October 1868 to take the In the Bluffs views, he would have been 24 years old. The local Winona newspaper also advertised the release of the completed set of views. The paper said the views were fantastic. It went on to say there were 20 or 30 views in total, and they encompassed the bridges, the deep cuts, the jagged bluffs, stone pillars, the mountains, and the sparkling brook itself. Later in life, Zimmerman bought out Whitney, then built his own building, which became one of the largest galleries in the United States. Zimmerman's gallery was shown in the 1874 Andreas Atlas of Minnesota. Zimmerman's photograph also appeared in the New York Graphic, as part of a group of influential North American photographers. So what else can you pick out in this series of stereoscopic views? If you look closely, the number 244 appears on this view. Usually this number was a code, which was explained on the other side of the view. In this example, view 1152 would have been a locomotive stuck in a snowdrift. Although Zimmerman's views were all numbered, there was nothing on the other side of any of the views. In view 244, I was immediately struck by the lack of vegetation or trees on the Bluffs in 1868. If you visit the site today, the trees are thick. Even on the 1874 drawing of Winona, which shows the Bluffs in the background, they look fairly barren. View 244 also shows one of the bridges up close. The bridge timbers look very square, which means they were cut by a blade in a sawmill. You can also see how some of the joints were connected. These were likely built on the ground and reassembled on site. View 245 shows a pile of railroad ties along the track. Compared to the bridge timbers on the previous view, these look rougher, so they were likely cut by hand. Some of the ties still have bark on them. View 246 showed a boy standing on one trestle next to a wooden barrel. Wooden barrels, filled with water, were placed at strategic points along wooden trestles in case of fire. Wood or coal-burning steam locomotives produced a lot of sparks. If a fire broke out, these were the only means of fighting it. View 247 showed one of the deep rock cuts. View 248 caught a group of 3 children sitting along the track with a pail. These children could have been walking to or from school, or could have been out picking berries. The children may also have been playing in the sand. This photograph from the year 2021 shows how sandy the cliffs were. Piles of yellow sand lay near the bases, which would have been fun for kids to play in. View 250 showed the varying lengths and sizes of ties. The railroad bed was also covered in gravel or soil. You could really get an idea of how tall these bridges were from view 252. Fill can also be seen on the image. View 253 stood out as it showed a locomotive with 3 crew members. If you look closely, this was locomotive number 4. Most railroads also named their locomotives, and the Winona St. Peter was no exception. They called locomotive number 1 the Tiger. Later locomotives were called the Mankato, Rochester, and Owatonna, after towns along the route. Garvin Brook could be seen in view 254. A man and 2 boys appeared in view 255. This bearded man appeared in several other views, so he may have been Zimmerman's helper or his younger brother. An entire train appeared in view 256. 3 men stood up on top of the cars for the photograph. Looking closer, this was locomotive number 3. View 257 showed the 3 men who were standing on top of the cars in the previous view, now riding on the locomotive. View 258 caught the man and 2 boys again, sitting near another cut through the rocks. View 259 showed how steep some of the rock cuts were. View 261 showed the man sitting next to a large boulder. 2 telegraph poles could be seen on view 264. View 267 showed a rock formation that was known as the Pulpit. If you visit the historic S-turn in the Bluffs today, it is quite a bit different. The long wooden trestle bridges were covered with fill, but several of the Garvin Brook crossings were replaced with rock bridges. The most famous is called the Arches, which were built in 1882. Most of the site is open to the public as Farmers Community Park. And that is the story of In the Bluffs on the Winona St. Peter Railroad. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.